extend a sunny and warm welcome to our foreign distinguished guests who have traveled far to be with us today. The development of solar industry in the Philippines has grown exponentially since its roots in rural electrification in the 80s to the passage of the Renewable Energy Law in 2008 until the present time. In 2010, there was a total of 2 megawatts installed solar capacity for both utility solar and rooftop solar. Driven by the policy on feed-in tariff in 2012, the recorded installed cumulative solar capacity increased to 926 megawatts in 2016. Despite the issues and challenges, and there are many, the industry has thrived, producing achievements such as the Cadiz Solar Power Plant, touted as Southeast Asia's largest solar farm and second in the world in 2016. The world's largest rooftop solar installed on a mall in 2016 can be found at the Robinsons Mall in San Fernando, Pampanga. And way before that, a 42 megawatt PV rooftop system in the Cavite Economic Export Zone pleasantly surprised the industry. Solar home kit and microgrid solutions are valued contributors to reaching the government's goal of 90% household electrification by end of 2017. These are just to name a few. It is a bright forecast for solar in the Philippines. As the technology is developing by leaps and bounds, our government has been diligently reforming and finalizing policies that will push renewable energy forward. 2017 has been a year spent learning from the past and planning for the future of RE. The approval of rules such as the RPS aims to increase the share of renewable energy in the energy mix by 45%. Results of the consultations on the clarity of solar rooftop regulations and the liberalization of rules on island installations give us hope in the expansion of solar capacity in the months to come. With the closing of fiscal incentives such as the FIT scheme comes the growth of the various distributed energy resource models. Solar, C&I, residential, microgrid, and co-located solar plus storage solutions provide opportunities for developers and wider options for consumers. Our agenda for today will touch on the different distributed energy applications. Together with our invited experts and trailblazers, we will discuss on the perfect marriage of solar and battery and what it means for the market. The Philippines being the perfect site for island installations, we will also be talking about hybrid and microgrid solutions. Then later today, installers and developers will discuss the challenges and interconnection procedures for on-grid rooftop systems. We will also learn from our experts and our neighbors who are more advanced in this technology on solar plus battery co-location in microgrid applications. All in all, today's conference promises an interesting lineup. Now, to start our program, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. To inform us on opportunities of distributed energy in emerging markets, our next speaker heads Bloomberg's BNEF's Frontier Power Research Team. The research team specializes in the analysis on the role that distributed and hybrid energy play in frontier markets and remote regions. He is based in Singapore and has covered clean energy markets for Bloomberg since 2011. Please help me in welcoming Mr. Itamar Orlandi.
Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Claire, very much for the introduction, and thank you, Eddie, for having me here and giving me the opportunity to talk to you all. So as the introduction said, my name is Itamar Orlandi. I work for Bloomberg New Energy Finance. We're a team of around 200 experts sitting around the globe and really covering those 10 sectors that you're seeing on the slide. And the common theme here is that what we cover is the transition of the energy system. So I was asked today to speak about opportunities for distributed energy globally, but also in the ASEAN region. And I thought, therefore, the best way to start is to look very globally on the macro level, where we see the world going. And once a year, we do an exercise where the experts from all of these sectors come together out of their sort of trenches of their individual sectors and look, what does it all mean for the energy sector going into 2040 over the next sort of generation? And what I pulled out here is the data for the ASEAN region. Essentially, it's technically not a forecast, but it's a modeling exercise, and it's really led by what is going to be demand for electricity and what is the least cost way of meeting that demand. And the result of that analysis for the ASEAN region and the 4 key markets here is what you see on the slide. We see about 376 gigawatt of power generation capacity being installed in the region between now and 2040. Around 200 gigawatts of that, or about 2/3, is going to be renewables, primarily solar. And quite crucially, out of that solar, about 78 gigawatt is going to be in small-scale installations. Small scale is defined as below 1 megawatt per site. So that's about $60 billion of an investment opportunity in small-scale solar in the ASEAN region. Now, some call this a relatively bullish forecast or outlook for solar. So we should probably justify what makes us think that. And the story for that really starts with this chart, which some of you may have seen already. What we're looking at is, on the y-axis, the cost of manufacturing 1 watt of PV capacity. And on the right-hand axis, what we're looking at is the cumulative historically built capacity. And you can see the prices, and what you can see is quite a clear trend line over the last 40 years that has come down. What that trend line indicates is that for every doubling in cumulative capacity, we're seeing about a 28% reduction in cost. And you can see in areas like here, we've seen deviations from the trend, usually driven by essentially short-term fluctuations in supply and demand. But over the long term, we're basically bang on with the trend again now. So that's a very fundamental driver of PV economics, and the results are simply staggering. It's what we all know, but very, very dramatic cost reductions. Now, the cost of PV is not driven by the module price on its own. It's actually, the module price is about half of CapEx. So when we look at really what drives the forecast, it's the levelized cost of energy. And what we're seeing across the region here is that over the next, both wind and solar in most markets are either already competitive with gas or are going to be competitive with gas in the very near term, sort of the next 3-4 years. Towards the middle of the next decade, we're hitting competitiveness with coal in most markets as well. The obvious outlier here is Indonesia, which has very cheap local resource on the coal front. So that starts to hit a tipping point, essentially, where it just becomes cheaper to build when you need to hit an extra megawatt hour of power generation, of energy. It just becomes cheaper to build that via renewables than fossil capacity. We're also seeing, and I'm not going to show this here, we're also seeing a second tipping point, typically hit later in the period, where it actually becomes cheaper to build new renewable capacity than to generate from existing fossil fuel plants. That's a bit further out in the future. But I said about half of the PV capacity is going to be built in small-scale installations. And in small-scale installations, it's actually not the levelized cost of energy on the wholesale market, which is what we just looked at, that is going to drive the market. But it's really what you pay installing solar on your own roof or behind your own fence versus what it costs to buy energy from the grid, so-called socket parity. If you look at that today, for commercial customers, that is already the case in quite a few jurisdictions. Notable names here that I want to highlight, places like Australia, where we've seen quite a boom in small-scale solar. More recently, also places like India, where over the last year or two, commercial and industrial solar has really seen quite dramatic uptake, or uptake rates at least, and that is entirely driven by costs. Fast forward this picture to about 2025, and really we're going into the green zone. As long as you're south of Canada or Russia, which are not known to be very sunny places, you're basically in the green zone. So that picture is going to become a lot more common, and we heard in the introduction, in the Philippines, that's one area where this is already happening. If you look at the region here, the ASEAN region, nowadays it's basically the Philippines is the only one. By 2025, this is going to be common across the region. And that aligns with another trend that we're actually seeing, which is corporates seeking to buy their power directly, and often renewable power. That is driven by various considerations, by locking in prices, getting rid of volatility of retail rates. It's driven by sustainability considerations of their supply chains, both of their own facilities, but as well of their supply chains. And it's driven by cost. So what we're seeing, this is a trend that started in the US, corporates signing direct PPAs. Over the last few years, we're seeing growth, both in the EMEA region, but also in the Asia-Pacific region. And one of the things that we hear when we talk to these companies that are buying this power, that are signing these PPAs, buying the PPAs, is actually in the US, they get the process. It's quite straightforward already. The regulation is there. You can go and buy a PPA. In other regions, it's often not as trivial. It's often not as clear. So we speak to textile manufacturers, say, that have facilities all over the world. And in many of the countries where they operate, you're actually not allowed to go and sign a direct PPA. The regulation isn't there. So that's another driver that pushes them to simply self-generate. And the second driver that they're seeing in a lot of the non-OECD countries is actually this picture. Reliability of the power system is not always a given. Especially if you look at places like Laos, Cambodia, but also based on the stats here in the Philippines, it's not quite perfect yet. And the numbers we're seeing here and where it's usually measured are the capitals. We all know Delhi here looks quite the middle of the bunch and actually not that bad. Everyone who's ever traveled to India outside of the capital knows that power reliability isn't quite what it looks like on these drivers. So that has actually led to a situation where we're talking here about decentralized energy being something new and being the future. But actually, in many ways, non-OECD countries are already familiar with decentralized energy. What we're looking at here is the grid, essentially, the power system of, again, the ASEAN region here, Southeast Asia. And what we're seeing here, we started in January 2015 with about 178 gigawatt. We added about 7 gigawatt of fossil capacity, a little bit of wind, a little bit of solar, some hydro, biomass. Overall, 10 gigawatt added to the grid. That's essentially what the statistics agencies will tell you. We also looked at customs data to understand what other energy generation capacity is being installed. And based on that, we estimate that there may be another about 7 gigawatt of diesel generators that are being installed in the region. We don't know exactly where they are. We don't know how they're being used. But that is essentially a consumer-driven demand of people that see they don't have the reliability, they don't have the access where they need it, and they need these generators to generate their own power where they can't rely on the utility, where they can't rely on the system. So that is quite a big, if you like, the shadow energy market. And really, in many ways, we said solar is competitive with utility scale fossil fuels. Diesel is the most expensive fossil fuel, diesel power generation. So typically solar is competitive there, and it's barely started to make a dent in this market. And that is essentially, in many ways, one of the addressable markets for hybrid power generation. So looking at where microgrids and hybrid power generation is happening in ASEAN, what we're seeing is actually still quite small. There's a small number of projects, and there is a relatively large pipeline, but we don't know what share of that pipeline is going to be met. And I should caveat this, that the numbers here that we're seeing are installations over 100 kilowatts only. So at scale below that, we might see more. But one of the things I want to mention when people talk about microgrids and looking at these smaller assets is, excuse me, here we go, sorry about that, glitchy hands. One of the things that I want to mention when we talk about microgrids is often people view that as, okay, I'm just going to build a power generation facility that is off the grid. It's not connected, but it's going to serve a community. And actually, in our experience, everywhere where we're seeing, it's not quite that. One of the key, it's really that the differences, or the hard part, is not going into a region and doing the engineering, building the system. Really, the business model is completely different when you go and serve a community directly. One of the key things that we can illustrate that is you're taking on a lot more retail risk. You really have to be, you can't just sell into a wholesale market. You are the go-to person for your customers. And when we break down what the customer base is looking like, we've done this, these aren't projects in the ASEAN region, but projects elsewhere, but I think that the lessons are quite transferable. Most of these community grids really rely on the top 20% of customers. So your revenues come from, if you like, local elites or super users or whatever you want to call them, but there is a very high amount of differentiation in the ability and the willingness to pay for power in some of these regions. And if you're going in, you have to deal with these things. So a lot of the microgrid developers that we're seeing, even if they don't plan that from the beginning, one of the first things after they install the supply, they immediately turn and they start to actually create demand. So they start to subsidize or provide financing or roll out and distribute appliances that can actually consume all the demand. And one of the things as well that we're seeing is that it becomes very tricky, and they're highly incentivized to then match the demand profile with the supply. So typically we're talking solar, you're seeing a lot of supply during the day. It's not cost effective to store much of that. So you want to incentivize the high loads, and often you can trace it down to 1 or 2 machines installed in a village. You want to incentivize those to run during the day and consume all of that power. So the business model is really very different. And while we speak of this, there's one other area that I want to highlight, and actually a separate business model that has quite effectively managed to take advantage of these variations in the willingness and ability to pay for electricity. Because we all know it's there. People in those villages they pay for diesel, they pay for kerosene, they pay for electricity, they pay exorbitantly high rates if you calculate what the equivalent is per kilowatt hour. But again, that's distributed. So one of the businesses that has done that is the pay-as-you-go business model. What that does in a nutshell is sell solar home systems to individual households, and it's bundled with a financing system. So the cost is spread for the consumer. It's usually comparative, or the cash flow is comparative to paying for fuel-based energy. And you can pay it back through mobile money often, things like that. And what the operator has the ability to do is remotely shut the system off if it's not paid for. So the customer is incentivized to pay. That business model has seen quite impressive growth, primarily in East Africa. We've gone sort of 2.5-fold growth over the last 18 to 20 months. We think there's about 1.5 million households globally currently being served by that system. And again, 2 years ago, that was about 500,000. And when we started looking, and one of the things that's actually impressive with that is it's really not about energy anymore. The LCOE for these things, if you calculate it, is 2, 3, sometimes even more dollars per kilowatt hour. So they're not competing on a cost basis necessarily with the grid, but they provide a lot of other values, and they've raised the interest of various other players that are, some of them are energy players, but some of them are telecoms who benefit from more usage, more revenue for themselves, and also the payment mechanism. They usually own the mobile money system. We're seeing interest from connectivity players, satellite TV, social media networks, or software players, and again, even insurers that can boost each other's business models, or even drinks manufacturers. Apparently cold beer sells better than warm beer in some regions. And so there's a lot of convergence actually, and what we're starting to notice is the energy is really a means to an end. It's not the final thing that drives the business here. And 2 years ago, when I started looking at this, I think we saw this is a model that is quite interesting. It's quite innovative, but it's going to be a long way to mainstream that. Now we've seen quite impressive growth on the uptake and the sales numbers. But when we also look at Africa, where this is just I think the 11 largest solar deals that we tracked in Africa since January, and all of a sudden we can see this distributed energy. This is not just the future, this is not a future business model. It actually covers some of the largest solar deals in Africa this year, both an M-KOPA deal for an $80 million facility, a Mobisol loan facility, and a few rooftop projects as well. Now, what this is to say is not necessarily that pay-as-you-go solar is a giant industry already, because it's not. It's quite clear that it's not. But it shows it can succeed in a way in an area where actually utility-scale PV is struggling as well. A lot of the developers in Africa are struggling with securing land, securing PPAs, securing financing, hedging, all of these things, whereas these upstarts have come in quite fast and have established themselves now in this solar deal landscape relatively quickly because they can move without PPAs, without regulation. They're not selling power, they're selling a retail product, essentially. So where that leaves us, wrapping it up, essentially, is that what distributed energy really does is a bit of a paradigm shift. And we've seen that it's happening already with diesel, where consumers take initiative and buy energy where they don't get it. What solar and increasingly storage do is provide a cheaper and cleaner alternative for that. But really, distributed energy doesn't necessarily need to compete on cost, because often it can't. A centralized system, if you pencil it out on paper, is going to be cheaper. But the old system is driven by essentially big engineering. All the economies of scale that drive down the cost are built on building a huge power plant, a huge transmission grid that can get this power to the consumers. Once you've built all of that, it's quite cheap. All the economies of scale are in that construction process. And that system has been very, very good at delivering cheap energy and delivering the ability to just plug in whatever appliance you like, and it's going to work. So that system's pretty good, but it is tied to that infrastructure. It only works where the grid works 100%. One tree falls on a line, it doesn't work anymore. The alternative, or the system that we can start to envision, is a different system, is a distributed energy system. It's driven by technologies, PV and storage, which have all the economies of scale in the manufacturing process. It's the gigafactories that drive down the cost of these technologies. Then you put it in a container, you ship it, and you basically plug it in. Installation is quite easy. And what that system does is it's responsive to infrastructure gaps. And it does this thing where it allows the consumer or the customer to just access it whenever they want. Be that a company that does corporate procurement or has unreliable energy supply, or be that a villager somewhere in a remote area that is currently off the grid still. So we go into a much more customer-driven world. And that has a few implications here in that what that means is the barriers to entry are going to be a lot lower in this world. Again, it's just shipped into a box. Everyone can install it, basically. And really, it goes away from competing on a commodity basis on dollars per kilowatt hour, but we're competing on who can actually provide the best service with that energy. So it's a lot more downstream. What do you actually help people do with that energy? Is it locking in power prices for corporates, or is it help people produce livelihoods through agriculture, through actual services that directly increase their own income in the energy access space? So I hope you found that interesting. That is the outlook as we see it. It sounds like from the program we're going to touch upon a lot of these topics during the day. That was my bit for today. I don't know if you have time for questions or if you want to move on, Claire.
Thank you very much, Itamar. These trends are very much reflected on the ground here in the Philippine context, Itamar. Especially the pay-as-you-go. A lot of companies are coming in. Especially, there are also not only the solar component of that, but the IT component as well, because the platform, and there are some logistics companies and even those customer service companies that are going into this pay-as-you-go model. So we're opening the floor to questions from the audience, please, for Itamar. Yes, sir, please.
Hi, good morning. One of your slides mentioned about community electrification as one of the strong pipelines. Now, in community electrification, two questions. One is, are you still looking at within a community residential applications, or is it more of a common ground applications? And if so, let's say we take one barangay or a municipality or community over here. Are you talking about something which is there's a community center lighting up that, or is there an agriculture machine that is common to everyone? Is that the electrification, or is it still at a residential level?
The vast majority of the projects we see in that list are of the sort of residential focused. Although we have seen a few, and I think there were a few in the Philippines that are sort of irrigation driven, which, I mean, but as a side comment, irrigation is basically a no-brainer application because you can store the energy in a water tank. You don't need a battery at all. You just pump when the sun shines. So the majority is still residential driven. But I think sort of the conversations I observe is that there is a growing awareness of this productive use applications that can actually increase livelihoods. Do you see it entirely in the pipeline yet? At least in the announced pipeline, not sure.
Because the only reason I'm asking this is, if you're talking about community electrification, is not the go-to-market, but the approach, is it sign up everyone within the community, or is it sign up a few? So is the go-to-market still residential, or is it a community stakeholder who's deciding that the entire residences within this community go on to this microgrid or something like that?
I see, that's a good question. I think generally the business model for microgrids for villages is not, there isn't a blueprint for it yet. For pay-as-you-go solar, you can see the blueprint. Most of these players start to converge. around something that is relatively similar. The new ones that come in do a similar blueprint. For microgrids, we're not there yet, so everyone tries something different. The system size approaches, and also the business model. You get some of the smaller players that basically come in, and I'm talking Africa now, who come in and say, I'm going to set the facts on the ground, and then I'll sort it out with the regulator once I show that it works. You can only do that if you're below a certain size, probably. In this region, Philippines, Indonesia, island nations, what we've seen so far is actually much more of a top-down approach, right? So that the government is more heavily involved. There are targets. Indonesia has had a program for years, if not decades. PLN is involved. What we're seeing here is actually companies like NGG, and Caterpillar. They're all somehow involved, and they've all signed MOUs with the governments to roll out 100, 200, several hundreds of villages. So it's a lot at the announcement stage. We haven't really seen much traction of that on the ground. I'm not sure they know in all cases exactly how they're going to do it individually, but it's very residential focused.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Any more questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
On a lot of these island microgrids, very remote, and it's one thing to just logistically get out there to do the work. But then the devil's in the detail following that is how do you collect your payments and whatnot. And I presume you're requiring some sort of on the mechanism for a prepaid, pay-as-you-go, that's a cell phone type of software where you, just like loading up your cell phone itself, you've got to have a connection to the telecom in order to facilitate this payment process?
Yeah, there is, so typically, and again, that model is more proven in the pay-as-you-go solar home system space, but generally what you're saying is exactly right. The hard part is not installing the system. The hard part is then keeping that operations, collecting the revenues, etc. That is really the hard part. Software-wise, there are technologies. People have managed to do things that, do smart meters that can work with unreliable connectivity, mesh networks, etc. So those things are available, and as well with the payment mechanism, there are ways in which it's done where you don't actually need connectivity at the actual residence. People have found ways to do these things, but certainly in general, I think there's a growing awareness of this sort of nexus between energy and connectivity, because ultimately, let's face it, the telco industry has done a far better job reaching these populations in remote areas than the energy industry. I mean, that's undebatable. And actually, everyone's heard the sort of, Africa, remote areas have leapfrogged wired communications directly to wireless, but that's a two-stage process. So far that story has been written on 2G networks with very basic phones. The telco industry now expects another 1.3 billion new smartphone connections in the next few years in some of these same regions. So a lot of these areas the telcos assume that they're going to be that they're going to be connected. And there's actually a question of how are they all going to charge these phones, etc. So connectivity is definitely crucial. I think there's probably an opportunity for the energy sector to essentially hitch a ride with that connectivity, because that seems to be either the sector is better or the pull factor for people to want connectivity is much higher than energy. But it seems to go much faster in connectivity.
Yes.
Please.
Just a quick question about the trend in Africa about the pay-go and the connectivity. Do you see any common link between the expansion of the connectivity, the connection of the people and with the energy demand. There can be a correlation between the two because in mind I have that you have a telecom tower, you need energy. So if you have the energy, you can even share that energy with the local people. So do you see any correlation or do you see that the telecom operator will be also energy operator?
That's a lot of questions around a good nexus. So I think do we see a correlation? We haven't sort of done the math on it, but I think intuitively, and there's anecdotal evidence that it probably goes a bit both ways, but people who get energy tend to be more likely to use connectivity services. There are indications, that's not sort of hard data that we've shown. The other bit around the towers that you mentioned is that's a very good comment. We've done quite a lot of work, and it seems in the tower space, there's about 3% penetration of solar. As a background, I think it's about 1 million telecom towers that are off the grid or in weak grid areas, so they might have grid access for 4 hours a day, let's say, globally. Solar has about 3% penetration there, but typically hybridizing can reduce costs, and for various other reasons that are sort of related to the business model of how telecom towers operate, there's a bit of a window of opportunity there where people want to repower those systems, essentially. So I think that's an area to watch where more power is going to be installed or where more solar is going to be installed. The notion then is, can you use that as an anchor client and throw some wires to the villages around it? That's not quite as straightforward. Population density is really crucial there. India is a place that has quite high population density, so that model there's probably a few dozen sites that do that in various ways. In Africa, it's less, although the Indian players have now made announcements that they want to move into Africa. It's a player called OMC, which recently received or started a joint venture with Mitsui. But the population density in places like Tanzania is much, much lower. So when you need to throw 2 kilometers of wiring from a telecom tower, it may not make sense anymore. It may just be cheaper to actually install a system in the village. Great. I'll be around for most of the day as well, so if anyone wants to speak directly, please do.
Itamar, I have a question.
Please.
In your survey, has there been what do you call this, a successful pay-as-you-go model here in the Philippines, in the remote areas?
From what we're seeing, really the sort of venture-driven industry there is primarily focused on East Africa and is entering West Africa now over the last year, let's say, year or two. There's maybe one player in India that's doing it on a sort of notable scale. And Southeast Asia, I know there are a few players that are active, but the scale is much lower. Part of that has to do with mobile money availability, where, again, East Africa is miles ahead on that front. But the sector is really focused on East Africa. What we've seen, though, just last month is that NG bought a player, so has fully acquired Phoenix International, or announced that it will. And part of the intuition there is that is actually the first time where an exit strategy for these players has become visible, and that may increase the sort of number of copycats.
Okay, because based on my experience, there are a lot of pay-as-you-go companies that come to us for financing, and I think the challenge is correct. The connection with telco and software. The software they have already. The problem is how you pay for it, and usually we only have 2 major telcos in the Philippines, and they have problems forging partnerships with them. So I think that's one thing that has to be improved if we want pay-as-you-go to succeed in the Philippines.
Yeah. I mean, the challenge is not, as you say, the software is quite readily available off the shelf, or it's quite cheap to develop that. The hardware, certainly you can buy it on Alibaba if you need to. The hard part is building a retail business in those areas. So it's really operations, is how do you incentivize sales agents, how do you make them most effective, who do you target, what is your sales script, etc. It's all of these things, which is not an energy business at all. So it's not developing a project, signing a PPA, completely different business. Hence the overlaps with all these other verticals. And really what you need is, it's a startup business, right? So startups, usually 5 out of 100, if at all, succeed. So in order for this to be an industry, I think, right now there are maybe 5 or 10 that are doing this at notable scale. If you want to scale that, you need a few hundreds to start, and then maybe a few that will succeed.
That's right. Okay, thank you very much, Itamar. If there are no more questions, we'll be having a